Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you today. We're really excited about today's program. I am Martha Seelman. I'm the Executive Director of Studio Art Quilt Associates, or SAQA, SAQA. And we are a membership organization that's all things art quilts. We have about 4,300 members around the world. We travel up to about 30 exhibitions every year. We put on a conference. We're about to go up to Toronto for this year's conference. We're really excited to be able to be in person finally, see everybody. And then one of the things that we do is we run 2 auctions each year where our members make beautiful small artworks. And that's what you're seeing on the screen right now. These are the pieces that are part of our annual Spotlight auction. And the funds that we raise through this auction are what help us to put on all of the different exhibitions and outreach programming that we provide every year, including Textile Talks. We have almost 400 beautiful, very small 6 inches by 8 inch pieces that were made by our members. We're showing you a slideshow right now of pieces that are made by our members who have been on Textile Talks previously. And all of these pieces and many, many more are going to be available for bidding through handbid.com, which is an app for bidding. And if you go to SAQA.com/spotlight, there are complete directions on how you can bid. Bidding opens at the end of this program and continues for a little over a week. And these are just such fun pieces. They're great for gifts. They're great to just brighten up a shelf somewhere in your home. And your purchase is really helpful to us in being able to provide the kind of programming you love, to provide traveling exhibitions, and to help everyone learn more about the wonderful kinds of art that can be done with fabric and thread. So please check it out. If nothing else, you'll enjoy seeing all of the wonderful artwork that's up on the website, and it's really fun to read the artist statements and learn more about each of these wonderful small art pieces. I also wanted to tell you that our upcoming schedule is just amazing. You're going to want to tune in every week for the next bunch of weeks, because boy, do we have a lineup for you. Next week, the Quilt Alliance will be presenting interviews with the 9 designers who have created blocks of the month for you to enjoy as part of the Quilt Alliance's 30th anniversary. So you're going to be hearing from Andrea Sang-Jackson, Bonnie Hunter, Ricky Timms, Sherry Cifaldi-Morrell, Carol Lyles-Shaw, Georgia Bonsteel, Pat Sloan, Zach Foster, and Susie Williams. It's going to be an amazing event. In 2 weeks, we're going to be hearing from Nancy Crow, who is having an exhibit at the Schweinfurth Art Center, and they'll be interviewing her for that program. In 3 weeks, Kaif Fassett is going to be talking about his traveling exhibition, Kaif at 80, and you can see what he's been up to lately with his just amazing, colorful designs. And then Melinda Watt, who's a curator at the Chicago Institute of Art, will be taking you on a tour of their current exhibition of the work of Geo Swaby. And if you haven't seen it, it's absolutely amazing work, really fun, and you will have a wonderful time. Today, our program is another wonderful artist, Sharon Peoples, who's from Australia. And so because of the time difference, she's not able to be here live. So we had to pre-record it. It's really the middle of the night where she lives right now. And so we recorded her presentation, and then we also recorded some questions that I asked her. If there are additional questions that you would like to ask her, we will be sharing how to contact her so that you can connect with her directly. She said she's more than happy to answer any questions that she had. I really found this presentation so fascinating because she's going to take you through a history of where she started when she first started doing embroidery to all the different ways that she's explored the medium. Some of them are two-dimensional, some of them are three-dimensional. And I became aware of her work because one of the subjects that she keeps returning to are birds. And as you may know, I really love birds and am writing a book about birds and fiber art, which will be out in October. And I was just blown away by her work and about how everyday objects intersect with the different things that inspire her as she's making her different kinds of creations. So we're going to turn on her video. She's going to introduce herself and show you a little bit about her journey through the art of embroidery. So glad you could be here with us.
Hello, I'm Sharon Peoples, and I'm speaking to you from Canberra, Australia. And I've recorded this talk specifically for the members of Studio Art Quilts Association. I belong to the Oceania group of SAQA, and there are some really inspiring contemporary quilt and textile artists. But here in Canberra, there are also some very exciting makers and members of SAQA. So today I'm going to share some of the paths that I've taken from constructing my stitch work and how I've moved from the gallery wall to more sculptural pieces that sit on plinths. I'll discuss how I began working to create small individual fragments that build up into larger three-dimensional pieces. So while I began making quilts for my children as utilitarian covers, I nonetheless produced work that I designed. Although I must admit, as an embroiderer, I couldn't help but go down the path of crazy quilting way back in the 1990s with a visit from Judith Montana, the US quilt maker. So over time, my quilts have become thinner to the point of being lace-like. So today I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint first to describe the work I do. Then I'll come back and then introduce a little video that shows the process that I use for working with soluble fabric. So I come from Canberra in Australia, down in the southeast corner, and I've worked as an artist for over 25 years, exhibiting nationally and internationally, as well as taking on commissioned work. And I've had over 10 solo shows since 2010. And the most recent is Working the Garden at the Southern Highland Artists Collective in Bowral, a little town 1.5 hours north of Canberra. I have participated in over 25 group exhibitions in that time, the highlights being Surface and Depth at the Palazzo Verli Expo in Rome in 2021, and Stitched Art is Art at the Clerkenwell Gallery in London in 2019. And both these exhibitions were organised by the Society for Embroidered Work. As well, I participated in the International Art Textile Biennale in 2021 that was held in East Gippsland in Australia. My work has been collected by national institutions such as the National Gallery of Australia, the National Museum of Australia, and our Parliament House collection here in Canberra, the national capital. Although I've made 3D pieces since the 1990s, it was really only 3 years ago that the curator of our local government collection here in Canberra bought one of my 3D pieces for the Legislative Assembly. This gave me the confidence to pursue this new way of working. Hand embroidery has always been my first love. My mother patiently taught me to stitch, starting with embroidering Semco doilies with patterns of pansies. As a teenager, I enjoyed the soothing rhythm of stitching, and it was at this time that there was a knock at the front door of the family home. Standing there on the other side of the wire door was an incredibly tall and slender young woman with round sunglasses, dark, wild, curly hair, wearing jeans that were totally covered in embroidery. It was the 1970s. I'd never seen anything or anyone like this. And Robin, my cousin, had spent 5 years teaching in Mexico. She was on her way home, stopping off in Melbourne, where I grew up. She called by to catch up, perhaps because my father had died the previous year. I couldn't take my eyes off her jeans. This embroidery kindled a passion, and as soon as Robin left, I began stitching my own jeans, not quite committing to the full leg of rich stitching. However, I love my new jeans, and eventually, outgrowing them, I cut them into shorts to extend their life. My mother died 3 years later when I was 16, hence a career in embroidery didn't seem like a way to survive financially. I studied interior design at the School of Architecture at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Consequently, design plays a strong focus in my textiles. In my 4th year, I was encouraged to exhibit 2 embroideries along with my interior design work. I married and travelled to Perth in Western Australia, and we started a family, and I continued stitching, working with textiles, keeping occupied with short courses and stimulating my mind. A move to the nation's capital, Canberra, saw me take up textile studies full-time. Random cross-stitch has become one of my signature styles in recent years. I love the repetitive, meditative qualities of hand stitching, as I'm sure many of you do when you're hand quilting. This portrait was made anonymously of an artist, Oscar. It was an online activity during one of the lockdowns for artists to participate in. Artists making portraits of artists. For many years, I waited for inspiration to come to me. Hence, in the early 2000s, I seemed to run out of ideas, or more defensively, I called it a creative block. I returned to study and ended up completing a PhD in art history. I then became an academic in museum studies, but the call of making was hard to ignore. I continued stitching while lecturing and researching, but not in the manner of a fully engaged artist. I've always been interested in using the body as a source of inspiration, and my work has been related not only to my own body, but to others as well. Once I gave up full-time academic career, I was worried I wouldn't be able to step back into a fulfilling creative life and began to search for ways to ensure that I could find inspiration. I enrolled in a 5-day intensive course with a very interesting Australian artist, Ruth Hadlow, who uses textiles when she requires them to express her ideas. This workshop was very challenging, and the purpose of the course was to stimulate artists by a series of questioning activities and lots of reading. As well, we were given some good tools for creating work that came from within. I had begun making lace-like textiles already, and Ruth provoked me to switch the word lace from a noun to a verb, as in lacing a drink with food or with poison. I then took looked at plants that were poisonous to the human bodies and made works with the title, such as this one, laced with Grevillea robusta. And this tree sitting on our front lawn has very poisonous sap, and the sawdust as well is an irritant to humans, but it doesn't seem to affect the birds. In 2017, another path I took was to sign up for a 6-week online course run by the American textile artist Jane Dunawall. While I was a little worried the course would be maybe too American for me, too quilt related or too superficial, this was also about searching for ideas from within. Writing was also part of the course. I loved the online environment, working away in my own studio with all my own materials and equipment. Unlike when attending a workshop whereby you never seem to have the right threads, fabric or tools, no matter how much you pack into a car. Although the point of the course wasn't new techniques, there were many exercises which I continue to use today. In 2019, I took 4 months to travel to Northern Europe. On my last day, filling in time before our midnight flight back to Australia, I visited the Garden Museum in London. This is a former church given over to the museum. In the churchyard were 2 significant graves. One was John Tredescant, a collector of plants and a figure who's always mentioned in introductory lectures of museum studies. The other was the grave of William Bligh, a very controversial figure in Australian history. But it was the wonderful exhibitions inside the building that were stimulating. It celebrated the everydayness of gardening, the labour of gardening, and the love of gardening. I came across a curious object, the small object in the centre of the slide. It is the ancient order of free gardeners. Initially, I burst out laughing, wondering what in the world did a free gardener mean? It fascinated me. It was not until I returned home that I researched and responded to these medals. I tend to keep work boxes for various unfinished projects in case I need to go back to them. And I found this one for the lecture, as I knew it was a stepping stone in my process. I had begun to make my own medals, some in metal, some paper, and others in fabric. In opening up the box, I now see that I'd begun to play around with gardening gloves at this point. Elsewhere, I've written about my work with gardening gloves that occurred during the first lockdown of COVID, and where I began making gloves, but I can see from this box that it was months earlier. I began cutting out various star shapes, some with 5 points, some 6, and some with 7 pointer stars, which are seen on the Australian flag. Because these were irregular, I could be freer in their placement. What I was essentially doing was using small individual motifs stitched together to build up a larger textile work. On the left, you can see flowers. I used star jasmine here. I must have been thinking about travelling in Spain at this point. Meanwhile, the gloves increased in numbers and were ready for exhibition, becoming walls of gardening gloves decorated with native plants that I saw on my daily walks up the local hill in the Bush Reserve. While I started thinking about how important my hands were to me and were needing care with all the gardening activity during lockdown, I began to see the gloves as a metaphor for caring for the environment. My artwork began to really focus on gardening and what was happening in the garden. This is a different iteration, and you can see here that birds began to appear more regularly in my work. And then I began developing the motifs to form 3-dimensional gloves, which at first I laid horizontally. These are made up of small bogong moths that have been regular visitors to Canberra each November. And then I set them vertically, covered in moths and butterflies that visit the garden. I began perfecting making gloves underneath that I could then sew an outer skin of insects on. I made wire structures inside to give the hands more shape. These were then part of an exhibition called Propagate that my youngest daughter and I conceived. She was new to gardening, and so a conversation about gardening between the two of us for 12 months occurred. So the exhibition was also a conversation between us. The exhibition toured Brisbane, Melbourne, and Canberra in 2022. I'm finding that doing residencies help me keep the stimulation going. And I realise not everyone can step outside their usual routine due to financial or time constraints. I had applied for many residencies without much luck of being chosen. I felt I needed to get my foot in the door. So the first real residency I took was at a local art centre, about a 30-minute drive across town each day for 4 weeks, looking at the plants used in local gardens. I had imagined that I was going to look at the fragile nature of gardens and respond through lace-like structures. But these suburbs are slightly colder in winter and a little hotter, and people grow very hardy plants. Hence, the work is more quilt-like and heavily machine embroidered. This was followed by a second residency in Melbourne at the Australian Tapestry Workshop for another 4 weeks, where I explored the plants of the house where I grew up in. Although my sister still lives in the family house, her husband had been a landscape designer, and the garden did not resemble my memories. Gardens are full of memories, and that's partially why I used a lace-like structure to show that fragility of memory. So we often recreate gardens based on plants we're familiar with or have some association with. In 2020, I was chosen for a residency hosted by Craft ACT, my local craft organisation. This was held in conjunction with the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the National Museum of Australia. I was focusing on the Anthropocene, and you can see the hills in the background. They actually have been completely burnt, and the hills actually surrounded a 360-degree area of this little valley. So I really started to capture birds and bird song. And here I'm showing you through embroidery on the fence, and I'll come back to that in a little while. I've just returned from a residency in the Blue Mountains, 2 hours west of Sydney. I was fairly isolated and surrounded by bushland on one side and a community of very formal and large acreage of gardens on the other. I spent my early mornings walking in the bush, then had a full day in the studio. In the evenings and on weekends, I was privileged to be invited to some of the amazing gardens. As a lover of gardens, I couldn't have asked for more. It seemed that the ritual in this little village, Mount Wilson, was to begin each visit with a tour of the garden. I see these residencies are time for gathering resources to take back to my home studio. The American poet Mary Oliver suggests that creative work needs solitude. It needs concentration without interruptions. Here at Mount Wilson, I could carry a thought all day long into the evening and continue with it the next day. As Oliver states, that ideas need the whole sky to fly in. I see residencies as a time for gathering resources to take back to my studio, and I've become more familiar with how residencies operate, rather than simply waiting for inspiration. I do a lot of journal writing, photographing, and drawing. I also use what the English textile artist Sue Stone calls positive limitations. I limit my vocabulary. At the moment, my vocabulary is gardening gloves, gardening tools, birds, and life-size gardeners. As well, hand-stitch works that fit into small found containers. This little container was a necklace box that opened up, and I placed a little embroidery of one of the landscapes. Having this limited vocabulary seems to be the best start with forms that I'm familiar with and work towards the unknown. Out walking one morning, I came across a signpost for a lookout over a sandstone precipice. I returned at lunchtime, packed with my drawing materials, ready to capture the things that I saw. When I got to the large panorama, I laid out my long roll of paper, set up my seats, opened my paints, but the view was too big and overwhelming for me to capture. My watercolors and pencils were not the tools for the job. I was a little dispirited. I stood up and looked around for a good 10 minutes. What caught my interest wasn't the landscape so much, it were the clouds that held my attention. They appeared like the purpley blue hydrangea flowers, similar to those that I had seen in one of the gardens that had over 40 varieties of hydrangea. Immediately, I thought I would draw up a large gardener using the hydrangea flowers as a motif. Meanwhile, to divert myself from the disappointment, I drove to the other side of the village to investigate another sign that said Cathedral of Ferns. This walk was short, but somewhere to sit and eat my lunch in the shade. On return to the studio space I was working in, I felt I would be wasting my time hand drawing in detail a life-size figure. So I let it pass and stitched the small cloud scene and the Cathedral of Ferns, until a week or so later, I visited a small waterfall, which was so wonderful. I was really taken with this enclosed space within this rainforest. It was an hour walk down through the dry bush, descending into a wet rainforest filled with ferns, lichens, mosses, and a gentle stream bubbling along the floor of the valley. It was magical. I imagine that in the past, people would have retreated here in the heat of the day in order to cool off. It is now considered to be a very fragile environment. I took my time watching birds drink and insects buzzing around. Back in the studio, I knew I still wanted to make a gardener, but I suggested to myself that perhaps drawing some gardening gloves might be a shorter step, a little like making a sample, before I embarked on a life-size gardener figure. Yes, drawing the gloves worked for me. I drew them up in pencil, but I really wanted to move on to that figure. I then lay on the floor of the studio and traced around my body on pieces of paper pinned together. And then I stuck the drawn figure up and began painting the ferns, mosses, and fungi from the waterfall valley. Somehow the figure began to take on a life of its own, becoming the waterfall. I responded, drawing and colouring for hours. While this is a spontaneous response, I will modify the figure when I get closer to making the real waterfall gardener. However, my stated project for the residency application was to make the oral visual, making birdsong into a visual piece. I had tried this earlier at the Craft ACT residency, where I ended up embroidering onto the fence. Here I wrote out the musical notation of one of our native birds, the butcher bird, and then stitched it onto the fence wire. Here in the Blue Mountains, there was no such fence, nor did I want to repeat myself. I was a little anxious not being able to produce anything along this train of thought until I drove to Katoomba, a township 45 minutes away. I was looking for interesting containers in the second-hand shop, and I glanced at a pile of pianola rolls, but they were too long, too expensive. They didn't really consciously register in my brain until later that night. I realized that the paper rolls could be used as they were another form of notation that was visual. There were many things I could do with this paper: drawing, folding, cutting, and constructing. I wrote in and drew in my sketchbook all the ways I could use this sound-producing technology. This became the focus of my journal writing for a few days, until I began to build a structure out of waste cardboard. I'd been thinking that I would use the paper horizontally until then. Suddenly, I realized that I should be using the papers vertically, as though they were coming out of the pianola. This was much more fruitful. I then had a conversation in my journal about how much the pianola I should use, the pedals that move the mechanism, or should I incorporate the piano keys? Although I didn't make textiles that responded to these ideas during the residency, I now have plenty of resources for me to begin stitching something. I just need the time to do so. My favorite Hungarian-American psychologist specializing in creativity, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, calls for us to become aware every day of how we are surprised by something. Try to surprise at least one person every day, and to write down each day what surprised us and how we surprised others. He notes, surprise helps us keep a sense of wonder alive and active. It is the surprise in artwork that holds our attention, whereas conformity can flatten our attention, our interest. By surprise, I don't mean novelty, but more a sense of being overcome or overpowered by our emotions. Just as the sound of a tree crashing in a forest is unheard if nobody is there to hear it, so creative ideas vanish unless there's a record and a receptive audience to receive or implement them. Creative people need validity from others through exhibitions. One artist rephrased this as, if an artist falls over in a forest and no one is around to hear them, what then happens to the artist? The artistic and creative work we put into our journals and sketchbooks can record our ideas, our emotions, what we're thinking, even document our existence, much like the quilts we make. The meaning of the word surprise in late Middle English was unexpected seizure of place or attack of troops. Here in our context, when we seize the borderlines, work on the edge with all the disasters that entails, we can unravel the restrictions and make textiles at the front line, and we surprise our audiences. We find new ways of recording original ideas, breaking traditional boundaries and stirring the gallery viewers' thoughts about what is art. The isolation of both the lockdowns of the last few years and the residencies meant that I would have a go at making sometimes disasters, but I persisted in constructing work. Experiential learning, the process of learning through doing, for me is one of the most powerful ways of developing our creativity. Csikszentmihalyi argues that creativity results from the interaction of a system composed of three elements: a culture that contains symbolic rules, a person who brings novelty into the symbolic domain, and a field of experts who recognize and validate innovation. All three are necessary for a creative idea, product, or discovery to move forward. Csikszentmihalyi gives the example of how a musician needs to learn musical traditions, the notation system, the way an instrument is played, before she can think of writing a new song. Similarly, I have found it stimulating to learn new traditions of quilt making and stitching fields, to take time to pay attention to such information, learn a new vocabulary and apply it to my studio practice. My art practice has become much more interesting and productive with this deeper pathway for creativity. I use my stitched work as a metaphor for repair. In this work are bogong moths that I have made individually. The moths travel from Queensland in the north of Australia, down south to the Australian Alps near Canberra to estivate or to spend summers breeding and feeding. A few years ago, 90% of the population was wiped out and the moths were placed on the UN Red List. Large amounts of arsenic were found in the dead bodies. Fragility of both the environment and the human condition are reflected in the media I use. As you can see, I oscillate between hand and machine embroidery to examine this state. So next, I'm going to show you a quick video of how I use soluble fabrics. Obviously, this video is not a teaching video, but an overview of my process. So now I'm going to show a little video of the process I use to make these small pieces that are then built up into larger ones.
I'm just going to give a quick presentation on video of how I cut out the individual pieces and embroider them. It's by no means a teaching video, but just to give an overview of how I work. I first start out with a sheet of drawings. These are drawn moths that I have collated, so I get variety, so some large, some small. I then trace those, just the outline, onto a piece of bondweb or Lysafix or Stitch Witchery, any of the pieces that have double-sided webbing on one side. I then take that piece and then iron it onto a piece of fabric. Now, I've cut one little moth out here, and to show you, and I peeled off the paper, and that's what's left. Here I've cut out quite a number of the moths. I've done it in the shape of a hand, just so I know which direction I'm going in. So I've ironed these little moths onto a piece of water-soluble fabric, something like Bro Thread, embroidery stabilizer, Solufleece, Solby, Soluweb. And I tend to use the fabric that's like this, rather than the plastic variety, because I like drawing onto the soluble fabric and embroider that, making very web-like embroideries, stitching that and washing it away. But I'll just come back to the way I have done the gloves with the bogong moths. You can see here there's nothing on these areas, but these smaller pieces have very fine lines. And that's because I discovered how to print on my printer. I have a Epson Workforce Pro. I found this out on the web, that if you iron a sheet of the bondweb on the fabric exactly into an A4 sheet, I can tell the printer that it's very thick paper. And I feed that in and can print fine lines all over, and then I can cut out each of those individually. I have some in yellow here, yellow fabric. You can still see some of the little lines on that, but it doesn't bother me because I'll be covering that in stitching. Just has the glue on the back, and then I would iron that onto the soluble fabric and very gently, or with a piece of baking paper over the top to protect it. And then I could stitch on that. So it's just really to show you, jumping a step of printing the paper into the printer without having to draw each piece on there. So that's just one of those little tips that I've learnt from the internet. And then I go ahead and start to machine embroider each individual moth, and I join together where the little feelers, any little legs, just fine stitching between. Some are quite heavy between there. So I start first off with the dot markings of the moth wings, then perhaps the lighter part, and then colour in with the darker parts. And so you can see that I can then bend that in any way to make a sculptural form. So it's just to give a little overview of this little gardening trowel that I made with the bogong moths on it, just so that you could have some understanding of the processes that I use.
So I hope you enjoyed that, and it gives you some insight into my work, and perhaps one day you'll be able to see some of the work I made in my residency at Mount Wilson. One day, hopefully that will be exhibited. So thank you very much for spending time listening to me, and thanks very much. Bye.
Sharon, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I really enjoyed seeing how your work progressed over time. And I have a couple questions that hopefully answer some of the things that our audience would like to know as well. The first thing is, one of the pieces you showed had a whole bunch of red shoes.
All right.
How did that piece come about? Because I loved that image.
Okay, so our local craft council had a postcard, not competition, but they wanted to get artists to make postcards. And I thought, oh, red shoes would make a great image. So I had some old red slippers, leather slippers, and I drew them. And then I made the postcards, sent them out and used them. And gradually red shoes appeared at my studio door. And that image that I showed were all the red shoes that had been given to me, from children's shoes to boots to so many variations. And so I ended up with an exhibition in Sydney called 100 Red Shoes. And that's how that piece came about. And I used that image for a number of years in the early 2000s, and it got me from Australia to the Amazon for a holiday. It was the first time I'd earned enough money for a trip for some of my family. And so the red shoes are very dear to my heart. But afterwards, I found it really difficult to move on. I felt I couldn't keep repeating it. And that is part of the time that I went back to study as well. It was such a high. It was really difficult to continue on in that way. So that is all very important in my story. I had sort of forgotten about that in fact.
I'm always drawn to images of shoes because they represent the person who was wearing them. And so they're a stand-in for the person. And I was interested that you did shoes then, and now you do gloves. And so I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how gloves similarly are representing people.
Yeah, they indeed, because even with leather gloves, if you wear them, they take on the shape of the wearer very much. And, you know, when they're left, they've fallen off somebody on the way on a bike path or something, they're still very much a three-dimensional piece for a little while. So that also really interests me, that the body interacts with part of the clothing, much like the feet and shoes. Yeah, so that's probably why I enjoy working with the gloves as well. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, in your Gardener series, they're life size.
Yes.
And you said you traced around your own body to create them.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about how making them so large impacts how people view them.
Yes. How I came about to make them so large is an economic economic reason. I wanted to buy the soluble fabric, and the place that sold it, she only would sell it in 100-yard lots.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I thought, and she goes, can't you sell it? And I said, okay, it's so economically viable, it's cheap to buy it in that, I'll buy it. So then I had quite a large amount, and I felt like I could experiment with, instead of having a meter and being very precious about it, I had so much then, and that I could sort of do anything I want and let mistakes happen. And that's how that really gave me confidence in a way. And so therefore I laid out sheets of it, sewed it together, then drew around myself. And then I started to photograph myself to use more images of bodies. And and so then took on that series in that way.
Yeah. That's so interesting how a sense of scarcity or abundance can really change the art that you are interested in making.
Yeah. It seems to, that excess, I suppose it's that excess of red shoes, the excess of gloves. I've never thought about it in that way. So that's an interesting point to make me reflect on the way I work. Yeah.
And then I wanted to ask, some of your gloves are 2-dimensional and some are 3-dimensional. And so did that come about, you started 2-dimensionally and then it became 3-dimensional?
Yeah, exactly. As I said in the talk, I had started working early, just flat gloves. And it was during COVID lockdowns where we were gardening, and I had these beautiful old white gardening gloves, and they were sitting in the morning light in the shed where I work. And I photographed them because the shadows were so beautiful. But I didn't sort of really think so much about that. And I drew them, and then I started to, embroider and whatever. And it was only really through making the pieces that I realized that the little pieces that I could try this 3-dimensional piece. I had made a pair of gloves once, and it was quite difficult, and they weren't, I couldn't get them exactly the same, the left and the right. I know it's just practice, but they're very fiddly. They're tiny, tiny seams. So I've made those a long time ago, but I still had the pattern, and I got it out, and I just wondered what I could do to make them 3-dimensional. And during lockdown, because we had so much time, I tried to answer every what if question during that time. In my journal, I said, well, what if I did it this way? What if we colored it this color? What if we made it black? What if we did it thick, thin, So it was part of my process of questioning myself about what if I made them.
Yeah. So the gloves went from being 2-dimensional to being 3-dimensional.
Yes.
And they also seem to have gone from being about your garden to being about the environment with all of the moths.
Yes.
And so are you thinking that you're going to do more about the fragility of the environment?
Yes, certainly I do. And using that lace-like fragility, the lace-like material, the medium is speaking as well as the ideas, and trying to make that apparent. I have enjoyed that process of, like, this avenue has opened up for me. by experimenting, and I perhaps wouldn't have thought about it if I hadn't have experimented in the way I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah,
I feel it's given me a much greater depth to my work.
Yeah, well, I also am a huge garden and bird fan, but I love the metaphor of the lace being a very fragile textile, and you talking about the fragility of our environment. I think that's a very powerful metaphor, and I can't wait to see what you do with it next. Wasn't that wonderful? I really enjoyed doing that interview a lot. I really love Sharon's comment about how part of what an artist does is to surprise her audience. That really is exactly what Textile Talks are all about. We're trying to bring you something to amaze and surprise you every week, having to do with the whole fiber art and textile field. So please do tune in the next couple of weeks. As I said, next week, Quilting Arts is going to be sharing a number of different designers and their interviews with you. Then we'll be hearing from Nancy Crow, Kay Fassett, and Gia Swaby, all very different artists and all full of surprises. If you enjoy Textile Talks, I hope you'll consider making a donation. Putting on Textile Talks every week costs a little over $50,000, and our sponsors cover a lot of that, but we also really value donations from our listeners. All Textile Talks are recorded and available on YouTube. This one will be up on YouTube within just a few days. And do please go to SAQA.com and check out the amazing spotlight auction pieces. The auction is opening in just 6 minutes, and it's really fun to look at all the small pieces of art and know that your purchase helps us to put on this kind of programming and to support all of our traveling exhibitions. It's wonderful to see you every week. Please have a wonderful day. Thank you.